In this episode, we speak to returning guest Ben Webb, neuroscientist and founder of Ology. We asked him back to talk about the teenage brain after he mentioned it on a previous podcast. And we explore why teenage brains make them behave in certain ways and why this can be such a challenge for parents.
We also dive into strategies to help you stay connected to your teenager so communication becomes easier and more effective, and also how to give your teenager the secure grounding they need as they move into adult life. This is a fascinating episode and we know so many parents will get a lot from it.
Hi, I'm James Davis.
And I'm Claire Davis.
We're the Midlife Mentors, here to lift the lid on how to achieve health and happiness.
The balanced, no-nonsense way.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Midlife Mentors with me, James.
And me, Claire. How are you all?
Today we've got a real treat in store for you. We've got a return guest.
Yay!
Yes, neuroscientist Ben Webb is back talking to us about the teenage brain. A fascinating subject indeed.
We had lots of people from the podcast that Ben did with us a few months ago now. Where he mentioned about the teenage brain, and we had lots of you say, make sure you do actually record that podcast. So we're really excited to have the lovely Ben back with us. But should we just have a chat about what we've got going on at the moment? We've got our retreat coming up in Marbella.
Yeah, so we've got our midlife reset retreat running at the stunning Punta Romano in Marbella, February the 17th to 20th. That is coming up really soon. Cannot wait for that.
So if you fancy a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of healthy living, out in Marbella, then we would love to see you there. And then we've got our retreat expert course that has just launched. This is like a drum roll situation, because James and I actually came up with this about 3 years ago, and then the world turned upside down. Our retreat expert course was basically helping other wonderful businesses, so other visionary business owners, coaches, wellness practitioners, set up, sell out and scale their retreats. However, obviously, when no one could travel, that wasn't really going to go down very well. So now it seems that the world is crying out for more retreats. We're seeing a huge demand for ours. The world is crying out for one-to-one connection, and we just want to help other people share their gifts.
Yeah, so excited about this course. And we're launching with a 5-day mini course for this. Again, we'll put where you can sign up in the show notes.
Completely free.
Free 5-day mini course. If you ever dreamt about running a retreat, haven't known where to start, this is the place. You know, we've got over a decade of experience, multiple awards, press accolades, and we want to pass that knowledge and experience
and all the mistakes to avoid as well.
Exactly.
All the costly mistakes. I think that's what puts a lot of people off, is they haven't got the confidence in the roadmap. So we're going to give all that information free for 5 days. It's going to start on the 28th of February, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes in case there's anyone out there burning and desperate to run their own retreats and get the support of experts. What else have we got?
Well, we're also speaking at the WellTech event in Dublin in March. So we have a ticket code for that. If you want to attend this event in person, it's going to run over 3 days. The first day is a cocktail party, and we've got a day of wellness and a day of tech, and the whole event is about where wellness meets technology. It's going to be fascinating. Some great speakers, including ourselves, of course. And we have a code for money off if you fancy attending that in Dublin in March. So we'll put the details for that in the show notes as well.
In person.
Exactly. Okay, without further ado, let's hand over to Ben.
So what are the things you mainly find? Kind of a summary around the teenage brain, Ben.
I mean, I think in terms of, so for parents with teenagers, trying to understand their behavior, which sometimes, to be honest, we have two teens as well, a young and 11-year-old and a 17-year-old. Their behavior can be really confusing for parents. You can be kind of quite alien because, you have this situation where you've moved from a young child that seems to, behaves really well, seems to, care for you, love for you, you've been looking after them, you've been nurturing them, and they kind of transition, and it's a gradual transition as they move through sort of 10, 11, 12, 13 into this kind of completely different person that you don't really seem to know or don't really seem to understand. And it can be really, really, really challenging and difficult, and sometimes quite distressing for parents. So the sort of what we try to do with the approach that we take is that really, really helps parents is a sort of twofold approach. One is to really try and help parents to understand what's actually happening inside the brain of a teenager and how that's influencing the way they behave, and that a lot of their behaviors are actually completely natural and kind of normal consequences of the way their brain is developing. And also as a parent as well, so sort of coming at it from two ways, you know, what you bring to the kind of relationship as a parent of your history and your history with your parents, and you know how that influences the way you parent your teenagers as well, and then kind of bring those two things together to help parents therefore understand their teenager better and help them to communicate with their teenagers, because of their own influences. So the sort of things that really matter, the kind of big things that really matter with the teenage brain, are that it's still being rebuilt. So it's still being built, it's still being constructed. So people often, when you look at a teenager, particularly kind of a slightly older teenager, you look at them, they might be shaving, you know, they could potentially get pregnant, obviously, if they're female. So they seem very adult-like, but actually their brain isn't there yet. Their physical appearance is completely incongruent with their brain development. So one of the biggest things is that they have all of the different parts of their brain in place, just like an adult does. So all the different parts that do different things that like help you move, help you see, help your emotions, help think and so on. But they're not connected to each other yet. So they're disconnected, and it's right the way from once the teenager hits puberty, right the way through to sort of their mid-20s, late 20s. So it's kind of 14, 15 years. Their brain is completely rewiring itself. So it's completely connecting up different parts of the brain and then giving more weight to the different parts of the brain that's now kind of using more as it works through the teenage years. So the big consequence for their behavior is that it can seem kind of quite disjointed, irrational, disconnected, and especially, to an adult. So to give you sort of a few examples, the kind of classic thing with teenagers is they're incredibly quite emotionally volatile. That 1 minute they can be completely fine, walking, slamming doors, shouting, overreacting to the things that you're saying. And that is actually a completely normal and natural consequence of the fact that the emotional part of their brain, so that's the limbic system, or the amygdala is a central part of that, isn't connected to the front of their brain, which is an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which you can think of as the sort of CEO or the boss of the brain that's controlling every other part of the brain. And that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it regulates your behavior. It stops you from becoming too impulsive. It stops you from becoming too emotional. It helps you kind of plan. It helps you kind of regulate your emotions. Those parts of the brain aren't connected up properly yet. So it's a bit like teenagers living in the sort of really, really emotional parts of their brain. They don't have a kind of boss or a CEO that's regulating, controlling that kind of part of the brain. So it's still developing. So those connections are kind of growing and strengthening as they go through the teenage years. So that can mean that they can end up being incredibly emotionally volatile. And the lack of connection of the prefrontal cortex with the rest of the brain is really what is the biggest factor that governs the way a teenager behaves. So another important aspect that parents often find challenging is that teenagers, it's not just teenagers, adults as well, but teenagers in particularly often want to spend 24 hours a day on their phone, gaming, social media, technology, which we all in the modern world is a big challenge for everybody. But teenagers are particularly susceptible to sort of addictive behaviors for a very similar reason, because their prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, isn't connected up to the part of the brain that delivers the reward and pleasurable feelings that they get when they play those games. So they go through this kind of cycle of, with those particular games, of playing them endlessly and endlessly. And because they play them so much, they don't get the same rewards and same pleasures as they used to, because they keep playing them in a very kind of addictive sense. And because they don't have a prefrontal cortex connected and managing that kind of behavior, it can spiral out of control where it's not being regulated. So they're sort of they're two examples. A third one would be a really big one for a lot of parents, is why teenagers sleep all the time.
Yeah,
they
I remember you saying that.
Yeah, so they they typically need about 8 to 9 hours sleep. It's more than we need as an adult, and that they're programmed to wake about 3 to 4 hours later than an adult, and go to bed about 3 to 4 hours later than adult on average. It's obviously different for different individuals. And the reason for that is, again, completely normal biological aspect of their body and their brain is this internal clock in their brain called the circadian rhythm is programmed for that. It's programmed them and their brain to make them sleep, to make them wake later and go to bed later. There's a different sort of theories about why that is the case. The most kind of one with the most evidence is that essentially teenagers are trying to become more independent from their parents. So this is a kind of push for them to be in a wake cycle that's different, wake sleep cycle that's different to their parents. So therefore they have, time to sort of gradually become more independent. So that's a sort of evolutionary kind of explanation, which I think is makes kind of sense. And again, it's a gradual thing, that shift forward in their circadian rhythm as they move from, the tweens, 10, 11s, right the way through to 18, 19. What happens is they wake and sleep later and later and later, and then they come back to being more adult-like as they get into the kind of mid-20s in their sleeping patterns. But it causes so many parents really struggle, because they, it's a lot of the time as parents worry that, it's an affront. Like, why, they get angry. Why, like, it's almost like they're deliberately just staying in bed. They're lazy. They don't want to get up. They don't want to, but actually there's a genuine, real sort of biological reason for that. I think I mentioned last time that there was a big push in the UK about 5, 6, 7 years ago to try and get schools to open later, to accommodate this kind of real change, and in the States as well. But it didn't happen anyway. Is the reality. But so there's just three sort of quite common sort of examples of the way the brain is driving their behavior. So when we're working with parents is we try to, first of all, let's start from that position. Let's try and understand some of the reasons why they're behaving, these brain reasons why they're behaving the way they do. And as you guys know with your work as well, that awareness sort of precedes understanding, and understanding precedes action. And once they become aware, oh, okay, it's not because of the way I'm behaving as a parent, or or whatever it might be. It's actually and it's almost out of their control to some extent. It's kind of driven by their brain development. Then some empathy and understanding comes for the way that they're behaving. So we then use that awareness to then move to sort of understanding kind of situation where we use kind of more brain-based kind of parental approaches, using some of that knowledge about the way they behave. To then, like, one way to think about it is to almost act like their prefrontal cortex for them until it's kind of in place. It's a kind of brain-based parenting approach in which you say, well, okay, you're not quite ready yet to regulate that aspect of your behavior. So here's some strategies, here's some boundaries, here's some things that you can put in place. So let's say with screens, obvious things like, not playing on them, or using them an hour before you go to bed, having time limits around using them, things along those sorts of lines, and just helping people. Because once they have the understanding, that helps them and motivates them as a sort of parent to then use that knowledge to kind of put in boundaries around that behavior. So the bit you guys, you can jump in anytime if I'm talking too much.
No, it's fascinating stuff. I was just thinking, while you were saying that, I just remember, I might be wrong on this, but I'm sure I remember reading some research that's basically saying that your adolescent years, your teenage years are kind of your most dangerous because most teenagers take massive risks, like driving too fast, making bad decisions, drinking, experimenting with drugs. And is that probably to do with like exactly that? The prefrontal cortex isn't there regulating, so it's
That's
just
exactly right. Exactly.
Go out and try this thing, and not really thinking about the potential consequences.
Exactly. So one of the functions of because the prefrontal cortex is the highest order bit of your brain. It's the bit that makes us, human, if you like. It's the bit of the brain that's most evolved, and because of that, it does the most complex functions. So things like that. So exactly like regulating your kind of risk-taking behaviors, your impulsiveness. Exactly. So because it's not there sort of managing and regulating those behaviors, then you're living in this world where you don't know, understand, or can plan for the potential consequences of some action that you're going to take. And because you're living in your kind of emotional, impulsive brain, then you will go off and do these kind of risky things, and that can be anything from dangerous, kind of physically dangerous behaviors to more drug taking and drink taking, sexually, promiscuous behaviors and so on. Those are the sort of things, we see a lot with kind of teenagers of that age. And another reason is because I always get sort of drawn too much to neuroscience, so I apologize for that. But another reason is because the prefrontal cortex isn't connected up to another part of the brain which is there to help you learn from your mistakes. Right. So there's a part of the brain that actually corrects your errors. So those two parts of the brain aren't connecting with each other. And it's really, 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 really important part of the brain, not connected to the prefrontal cortex yet, still being developed. So teenagers have this double whammy of like, they're in this kind of, right, just go out, explore the world. I mean, it's a kind of emotionally kind of heightened state, wanting to take risks, don't have a prefrontal cortex regulating that, not connect to another part of the brain that doesn't help you learn from the mistakes so what happens is they take risks and they keep repeating the same, kind of risky behavior.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
It's fascinating as well that actually as we get older, so by the time, because we talk about this a lot, as we get to midlife, that has almost completely reverted and actually gone the complete other way. So we avoid taking risks, and we've learned by our failures so much that they actually make us inert and not move forward. So it's really, really interesting, isn't it? It's probably quite frustrating, really, for us midlifers when we listen, because there would be some amazing happy medium there somewhere where you've got that part of your brain that's kind of learning enough but not holding you back. And helping you feel comfortable taking risks, where all of that stuff really, really seems to be dampened down, doesn't it, when we hit midlife?
I mean, exactly. It's because, we have this kind of situation where we get these ingrained, as you guys know, these sort of ingrained brain pathways and habitual behaviors that we can't change. And that's because that pathway has been kind of reinforced over decades, In the teenage years, it's, like a sort of open road of pathways, different routes that they could take that are still possibilities without the kind of regulating which direction they should kind of move in. So they're like, it's like, they try all those things, and they have that, the stuff we talked about last time, that brain plasticity which allows them to learn super quickly as well,
so there's no wonder actually that you've got your teenagers and then you've got your adults, and the adults can't really understand what that was like, because we've completely forgotten and we're almost completely different. So us midlife parents, we're kind of risk averse by the time we've got to midlife. We've developed that so much, and that self-identity so much, that we're looking at our teenage children thinking, how can you not know that that's incredibly dangerous?
That's exactly right. It's great. I was thinking about exactly this thing the other day. As a teenager, I took a lot of risks. I did a lot of silly things. And I'm going through exactly the same thing with my 17-year-old at the moment, who is just out there living his best life. And I'm like, even though he's doing, very similar things that I used to do. And it's so, I have to constantly go and take my own course to remind myself, of why he's behaving that way. So you're right. Yeah.
But of course, what you're doing is helping people communicate as well, because that's the difference. It is bringing, like you said, awareness precedes change, and having that compassion and that empathy and understanding what, we were once that teenager. This is what's going on for them, but creating open channels of communication so that the teenager feels understood and the adult is understanding what's going on for them. Because the work you do it really, it doesn't just help the parents, it helps the teenagers not feel so alienated, because if they're at home with their parents constantly being told, you're doing this wrong, or this is bad, this is bad behavior, this is not normal. Again, they're in impressionable years as teenagers, and if you're being told all these, it's kind of criticizing. I know they're well-meaning intentions, but it comes across to that teenager probably, as I remember it did to me, as criticism and shutting me down and all that sort of stuff. So you're really helping the teenager as well feel like that they can, understand themselves a bit better. I mean, they're not alone.
Absolutely. And it's because the communication, you've hit that absolute nail on the head there, is so key with teenagers for two reasons. One is because they're in this emotionally charged state, so they're super sensitive to comments, criticisms, advice. So they're in that state, but they're also trying to pursue being independent. So they're in a kind of state of, sensitivity, want to be independent. They need the care, need the support and love from you, but they also want to be independent from you. As a parent, it's very hard to predict when that's from day to day, what state they're going to be in. But from a parent's point of view as well, communication is absolutely key. So we use this kind of what's called the sort of PACE model to help people learn how to communicate with their teenagers as a playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. So where you try to connect with them by banter to begin with, by being friendly, by having fun with them or whatever, and then be curious about the way that they behave. So rather than, as you say, coming in with a sort of criticism and and negativity, you try and be curious. So you start with a kind of wondering stance of, I wonder why you behave, this way. I wonder why, I wonder how that made you feel. And then you got to, and moving into sort of acceptance, in which you try and, you don't necessarily accept the behavior, but, you accept the kind of reasons and emotions, for what's driving that behavior in the first place, because all behavior comes from somewhere, so there's a reason for it. And then into moving into empathy and kind of understanding of why they behaved in the way that they did. And we use this sort of phrase of connect before you correct, sort of connection before correction, where you try and, because it's very hard to communicate with communicate with your teenager unless you are connected with them, so if they're distant, which often means them hiding away in their bedroom, not wanting to talk to you, or just spending time with their friends, which is a completely normal thing that you'd expect them to do. If you don't remain connected, it's very, very hard to communicate. And if you want to be able to influence their behavior, which we obviously do need to do sometimes if they're behaving in particular ways. So that's the sort of approach that we take.
Sorry, another thing I just thought about, you mentioned right at the beginning when we first came on, talking about helping parents as well understand, I think you said this, kind of helping parents understand where some of their reactions come from as well. We've got a whole, we see this in adulthood, and some of the stuff that I've worked on myself with, you see where that ancestral line has come in your behavior, if that makes sense. So if you've got children, it's really painful. I can imagine it's not always a nice thing to do, but understanding, taking responsibility and looking at why you're being triggered in a certain way, and having a look at your childhood and understanding how you were brought up. And of course there's going to be things when you've got a teenager that are triggering you from your past and your ancestry,
absolutely. It's so important as a big part of what we do when we're working with parents as well. Exactly that. Absolutely. To look at your history. It's to look at where to look at your relationship with your parents, your triggers, all the things that you're talking about, and the ways in which that's making you behave, and ways in which that's shaping your kind of parental style, and that honestly, that can be quite a challenging sometimes and kind of difficult conversation to have. And you can't, it's not that you can change those behaviors overnight, you can't, but some, it's as we've said already, a lot of time just some awareness of that can actually go a long way to sort of understanding. And it's also to try and to be kind to yourself as well, because often parents find themselves a lot of the time beating themselves up for the way that their children are behaving. And, you know, there's their brain reasons why they're behaving that way, you know, their genetic reasons, there's, you know, historical, as you say, parental reasons as well, you know. So that's a big part of how we try and help parents. Yeah.
And I imagine that connection, once you start doing that with yourself, and it's not just all about the teenager, it's actually looking at yourself as well, that connection potentially has potentially can grow stronger, because you're understanding how you're being triggered and how your teenage being triggered.
Absolutely.
Really
100%. Yeah.
I have something I'm fascinated to ask. I don't know if it's too early, like for us to know yet. Obviously, like Gen X, us, we're like called the bridging generation, right? We remember before digital, and now we've adopted it and we have it. But for teenagers now, they're digital natives. They've grown up with it. But is there any research yet on how being immersed in this, how it being so ingrained into their lives might be affecting their neuroplasticity, their brain structure?
I'm sure I don't know of any. Sorry, this is not a very good answer to the question. I don't know of any research that addresses that specifically. But I'm sure I'm
still early days.
So one thing that I do know about that actually is that, so when you talk about the kind of rewards system, you know, in terms of how, you know, so thinking about, like you say, being immersed in technology in particular, you can sort of a good analogy for the way the way your pleasure system, your reward system works, if you like, is a sort of seesaw, in which, you know, on one end of the seesaw is kind of pleasure, on the other end of the seesaw is kind of pain. And that what you find, I'm sure you guys see this with your work as well, is if you immerse yourself so much, and this can be anything, by the way, whatever it is, like, you know, so it could be romantic novels, if that's your thing, or, you know,
alcohol, you know, alcohol,
you know, but if, you know, for teenagers, technology, so it is a kind of behavioral addiction. When that seesaw gets pushed too far in the kind of pleasure direction, what you then find, so we knew this already, is that you now need more pleasure, you know, you now need more sort of dopamine, to experience the same amount of pleasure, you know. So that means, and then to get back to the other way, you have to experience pain, withdrawal, to get the seesaw back to being kind of level. So what we're finding is, in the modern world, to answer your question, James, is that actually, so because of being so, it's not just with technology, but it begins because of being so bombarded with rewards, pleasure, all of the time in the modern world, like 24/7. One consequence of that is that we end up with children that are much less kind of resilient, you know. So that's one thing. And end up, you know, can't put up with the sort of, you know, with so much of the sort of pain, because they're just used to being constantly kind of bombarded with pleasure and rewards in this kind of sort of seesaw model, and they find it very, very difficult to kind of tip that balance to sort of back to sort of some kind of equilibrium.
Well, I was saying this to a client this morning, actually, on a call. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because that reward system is so powerful. It can feel so out of control. It's like it's something that you don't really necessarily have control over. And it's that quick fix, isn't it? I feel this, so I want this. But then to do it the other way, to kind of wean yourself off that withdrawal, it's a longer game. And it's you know, we always have this short-term pleasure rather than long-term gain. But actually, it's almost like we need to switch that. And the long-term gain, for example, we'll talk about, you know, alcohol, having that quick fix of, oh, I feel better now. You know, I've had that glass of wine, I feel better now, I feel less stressed, I'm relaxed. You know, that's the quick fix for it. But actually, the terrible knock-on effects is huge.
Yeah.
You know, the next day, the next month, the projects you didn't get sorted, the exercise you haven't done, the good nutrition that you wanted to get. It's those things that we completely miss just for this thing that you're saying. It's the dopamine hit.
Exactly. And it's exactly the same with teenagers. So that's a really good way to sort of lead into this, is that you can help them, and, you know, exactly the same sort of strategies you might use to help someone, let's say, delay their gratification with alcohol, or, you know, whatever their sort of drug of choice might be, or, you know, whatever that habit might be. In the same way, you know, those are the strategies you need to try and help to develop to help and support your teenager. So one good one is that, you know, they come home, they need to get on their phone immediately, whatever it is, straight after school or whatever, you know, onto the gaming, and you can't stop them from doing that. So you need to put in place kind of strategy to start delaying some of that kind of gratification. So one thing you can do is they come home and they have to do chores first, you know, before they move into, you know, to the sort of pleasure phase of the kind of afternoon. You give them other activities to do to sort of gradually learn to delay that sort of gratification. You know, that's a really kind of small example, but you can kind of build off those sort of small habits to sort of gradually kind of delay their kind of that gratification cycle, you know. So in the same way you would with, you know, habit change generally, you know. So
and it's painful right at the beginning, you know, that you're constantly used to pleasure, right?
Old reptilian brains just like pleasure. I want it now.
You're used to pleasure, and actually it's you know, you talking about that seesaw, pleasure and pain. It's going to be painful. They're not going to want to do the chores. It's going to be painful for everyone to start embedding that new behaviour. But again, it's
chores are still painful for me.
You don't do anything. But you know, it's that kind of what's the longer term rewards. I'm sure you work with parents and teenagers around that potentially. Like, what might be a longer term reward that you're going to get to through going through that really short term bit of pain?
Exactly.
What's the longer one?
We do exactly. So the other thing as well, which is a big, I should mention, is that a really big thing, a big worry for lots of parents of teens is some of, I was thinking then when you say the kind of longer term consequences of some of these things is, you know, mental health challenges, which is such a prevalent aspect of the teenage years. And as you said earlier, James, that because their brains in this particular sort of state, they're very, very vulnerable to mental health problems, much more vulnerable than you are as an adult. So they're very vulnerable to addiction. They're very vulnerable to mental health challenges because their brain is in this state where it's not fully wired up. It's not fully connected up. It's not fully coherent. So there's some ridiculous statistics on, you know, that the vast majority of mental health problems actually originate in the teenage years, even very, very serious mental health problems as well. So a kind of third element to what we do, and on what we, you know, what we, a big chunk of the work that we do with parents generally is dealing with, you know, first of all, identifying, you know, some of the kind of signs, symptoms of particular mental health problems, and then putting in place kind of strategies you can do to help and support those at home. But obviously, you know, if professional help is needed, then obviously, you know, encourage them to seek professional help. And we do that in a way in which we're trying to do sort of both preventative and, you know, the other version in which you're trying to promote positive kind of emotional well-being in the way that your teenager lives their life in terms of their lifestyle and so on. So the two big things that we work with most are kind of depression and anxiety. They're the most common, but then we'll also help people with kind of more serious kind of mental health problems like self-harm, which sadly is actually an incredibly common one as well during the teenage years. But yeah, so they're, you know, that's what we're trying to, you know, as much as we can in a kind of preventative way to sort of help parents to support their teenagers by modeling and supporting them with kind of positive emotional well-being.
What you said there, just something really resonated for me was, you know, like so many mental health issues can be tracked back to this stage of our lives, which would make sense if our brains, you know, forming and rewiring. If we've got, you know, that unhelpful habit, that addiction forming, and it stays wired there, then of course that's going to continue to perpetuate if we don't take action to shift that path.
Exactly. So that's why it's a sort of you know, I was talking to someone this morning about this, that it's a time where you're most vulnerable, but you can flip that on its head, and it's a time where, you know, most positive change is possible as well, because it's the time in which your brain is, you know, during the childhood years as well. But these two periods during childhood development is one type of plasticity, and then in the teenage years it's another type of plasticity where you're most willing to change, to learn, you know. So it can be for good or you know, or for bad. So, you know, a positive way of that, teenagers are so good at learning, way better than we are as adults, so good at change, you know. And it's as a parent, part of your kind of role, if you like, is to try and put in the framework in place where you guide them towards, you know, positive change and, positive emotional well-being, rather than, we're often obviously talking about the negative, but often, so they're vulnerable to, both mental health problems, but also an addiction, but also vulnerable to doing amazing things as well, because they are amazing learners. So.
Yeah, so you've got this high degree of malleability, so it's like just steer it in the right direction.
Yeah. Have you got any tips? Sorry to put
put
you on the spot, Ben. Like, have you got any tips? Just, you talked about a framework, a healthy framework for your teenagers. Have you got just any tips that our listeners would benefit from?
So most of the things that we do, we work with kind of specific issues. So that the big issues in terms of a kind of framework. So that connecting before correcting, so as I said, the general framework, or tips is, first of all, try and understand the brain reasons why they're, behaving the way that they do, reflect on that, use that awareness to kind of think about their behaviors. So you can try and think about it in terms of just thinking about the behavior, think about the kind of brain reasons. And our general framework is to try and parent their brain, not parent their behavior, because their behavior is so challenging and so difficult. And then, that's easier said than done. So to actually be able to do that, you try and always stay connected to them, as I said, to influence their behaviors. And then in this framework of trying to kind of promote positive emotional well-being. But we work with specifics around sort of boundary setting for kind of the biggest challenges. So one of the most, I suppose, the most important tip is to sort of act like their prefrontal cortex, because they need, they need specific guidance, even though you think they don't. So around sleep and screens, risky behavior, we've just put in kind of frameworks of kind of boundary setting. So so for sleep, specific guidance are things like no screens for at least an hour before bed, because the blue light wakes you up, before you go. We should use it with an adult as well. But then also some really kind of, if we get into specifics, kind of counterintuitive things, like encourage them to have a bath before they go to bed, because getting into a bath, this is for adults as well, getting into a bath increases your body temperature. You get out of the bath, your body temperature plummets, and your brain needs to tell your body, or your body's temperature needs to drop by about 5 degrees to initiate sleep. It's one of the biggest reasons that people can't sleep, is because they're too hot. That's a very, very specific example.
No, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because we always say don't eat too close to bedtime. A lot of our clients don't eat too close to bedtime, because actually the digestion is raising your body temperature, and then you get to bed and you can't sleep. So it's a lot to do with temperature, isn't it?
Temperature, yeah, absolutely. So people don't, because often you don't think about it because you're under duvet and you get very warm in bed, don't you? And you're not kind of aware, but it's one of the big reasons with the stuff that you guys know already. So don't exercise too close to bed, things like that, because it's, so we have a lot of guidance around specific habits, and around screens. It's the same. It's largely sort of, it's very much kind of boundary setting, so, but we start that framework that I sort of laid out, if you like, at the beginning, is very much how we work with parents.
Awesome. Now, Ben, I know you've got a lot of great resources. Can you just tell us a little bit about where people can find you and what you have there at the moment?
So for parents, I've got a very specific resource if they're interested. So exactly in the sort of vein of what we've been talking about. So we have a free workshop that people can just go and watch, that we've done them maybe 2 or 3 times now, but it's there and recorded, but I know that people find is a really, really useful resource. So it's called How to Parent a Teenage Brain. And you can find that at ologyonlinecourses.com/workshop. So
we'll put that in the show. We'll put that link in the show notes.
So that's for parents of teens. That's a great place to sort of come in and see how we, it's just a free resource that you can watch. And if it works for you, at the end of that, we share our main flagship course, Nurturing the Teenage Brain, which people can buy as well. So that, which uses the same approaches to help people that need more in-depth help. So
Incredible.
Amazing. Great. Well, we'll definitely put that link in the show notes.
Is there anywhere else they can find you? People can find you? Any other social media channels? Anything else you want to?
You can find us everywhere at Ology Online. That's our
Ology online.
That's ours.
Across all social media channels.
Amazing.
Well, not all, maybe, but
yeah, there's so many now. The main ones.
The main ones, which are growing all the time. James decided that he was going to try and give TikTok a try the other day. He was on there for about 2 seconds and then decided it was never going to be a good idea. Never going to be a good idea. Oh, it just gets overwhelming.
I hate to say it, James. I think we might be a bit too old for that one.
Yeah, I think I am. My brain's set now. It won't accept TikTok.
I don't even let him on Instagram, really, do I, darling? I don't let you run wild on Instagram. Ben, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was so fascinating.
So much.
As always.
Again, and I know our listeners are going to love that because they asked for it, because they listened. If you haven't listened to the other podcast we did with Ben around the human brain and so much amazing information on there, specifically around midlifers, actually, do go and check that out as well. So thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Ben. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Midlife Mentors with Claire and James Davis.
We'd love to hear from you. So drop us a line at info@themidlifementors.com with any questions or topic suggestions.
And make sure you join us on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. You can find us under the Midlife Mentors.
Yeah.